All rise.
All right, please be seated.
Roy Coons Jr. is an innocent man. And no amount of guessing, speculation, assuming can take that away. The first 10 minutes of the state's opening statement to you was a guess. They guessed about, he walked this way, he must have done this, someone went through this way. All of that was a guess, because you heard no proof that any of that actually happened. And in fact, I told you at the opening of this case, this was going to be more about what you didn't hear than what you did. But I'm going to talk about both, what you did hear and what you didn't hear, and why the state has failed to carry the burden in this case. You didn't hear about any fingerprints belonging to Mr. Coons anywhere in that location. And we know from the experts that fingerprint evidence typically doesn't last very long. That's why they take the trouble to try to collect it immediately. There was no fingerprint evidence linking Mr. Coons to this crime. They checked the windows, they checked the doorways, they checked everywhere they could think, and they didn't find any of that. There were no eyewitnesses in this case who said Mr. Coons was anywhere around that location of C2 on the day that this happened. All we know about Mr. Coons' whereabouts that day is what he told you. Now, the state wants you to believe that those statements were suspicious. I'm going to show you in a few minutes why not only were they not suspicious, they were the words of an innocent man, and why. We heard a lot of evidence in this case about potential shoe prints. Well, they searched Mr. Coons' home, they searched his car. They didn't find a single shoe that matched this alleged shoe print that was on Ms. Ortega's body. Again, things you didn't hear about. Some of the things you did hear about were these text messages and DNA. These are things that happened. These are things that are there. So I'm going to talk about the text messages now. I'm going to talk to you about that in a few minutes. And I said that the state made some statements in their opening. They said, the text message said that Roy Coons knocked on the door. That's not what the text message said. They said that the man that cuts the grass knocked on the door. That's not what the text message said. The text message was translated by Ms. Ortega's mother. And she told you what it said was, someone is knocking at the door. He's gone now. I think it was the man who cuts the grass. And we heard in this case that there were 3 men who cut the grass. Mr. Coons, Mr. Hinton, and this gentleman named Mr. Drexel. Here's something we didn't hear about in this case. Where was Mr. Drexel during the time that they think that Ms. Ortega was killed? And I say I think because Dr. Lee, the expert medical examiner, said we don't know what time she died. There's a big assumption in this case. Again, the state's asking you to assume that she was killed sometime around right after this last text message was sent. We don't know that. And there's no expert proof that says that she was. She could have died at 4:30. She could have died at 5 o'clock. She could have died at 5:30. She could have been killed at 6:15 just before her mother arrived home. We don't know. So this business about whose cell phone is pinging off which tower is really irrelevant in the sense that we don't have a time of death in this case. But Mr. Drexel cut the grass. We know from his cell tower records that before the time they think she was killed and sometime after the time they think she was killed, his cell phone was pinging a tower not more than 8 or 10 miles away. The police went to interview him one time, was able to do so, never followed up with him again. Now, we heard in this case about DNA, and I don't want to jump around too much, but we heard that there was at least 2, and maybe as many as 4 or 5 unknown males' DNA strands in that home. Wouldn't it have been interesting to know if Mr. Drexel's DNA matched any of those strains, but they didn't get it? Now, I want to talk about Mr. Coons' statements because there were some important things in there that the state has left out. First, he told the police, and there's been no evidence to rebut it, that he had recently had a stroke. that he was weak on his left side. That's in his statement. Everything he said, though, despite what the state is trying to convince you of, did match up with the phone records. The very first statement he gave to police, he said, I was in and out all day. Means he came, he left. He came, he left. He told them that. It's in the very first statement, and I hope you all took notes, and if you did, refer to your notes over my memory. But in his very first statement to police, he said, I was in and out of there all day. Now, he also said at one point, I might have gone to Sonic. And the prosecutor, again, talking about inconsistent statements, the detective says, are you sure? And he goes, let me check my phone. He says, no, I actually went to Sonic on the 9th. Then they try to think, well, could you have been somewhere else at this time? Again, Mr. Coons, not knowing why, he's trying to be as honest as he can about his answers. He tells them, to the best of his knowledge, where he had gone and where he hadn't. And here's why I say his statement shows he's an innocent man. If you killed someone, wouldn't you have said you were somewhere else at the time? Mr. Coons' statement says, I was home most of the day. I was in and out, but I was there. He's not trying to mislead the police. If he had said, oh no, I was over in West Tennessee most of the day, his tower records would have shown that that was not true. But he didn't. And frankly, there's nothing about his statements that you've heard, all three of them, that is inconsistent with the evidence that you've heard. He tells police that he had been in and out of that trailer many times. Many times. He didn't try to distance himself from C2 like you would expect someone who may have gone in and killed this little girl. He says, I've been in there a bunch. I was home most of the day. I was in and out, but I was around. So if he's trying to cover something up, his actions right after do not match that because he tells them that he was there. Something else important, we don't know if it was ever followed up, was neighbors had told him that he told the police there were two Mexicans that were fighting somewhere nearby, and one of them, after the fight, the truck came through there and a neighbor saw that. We've heard no evidence that the police followed up on that, but he did say that. And the detective gives him plenty of opportunities to blame someone else. Could it have been someone else? And he tells you, he says, you know what, right after it happened, I did look up sex offenders in the area. I was disturbed to see how many there were. Those aren't the actions of someone who knows that they've committed the crime. If in his mind he knows who did it because it was him, he wouldn't be looking up other suspects. But again, he didn't try to put this off on anyone else in the mobile home park because he didn't know. Those are the actions and the words of an innocent person. I want to talk briefly about some of the elements because it's our position Mr. Coons is innocent. He didn't do this. But this thing about the attempted rape is based solely on what was described as loose-fitting clothing being pulled down. If this young lady who was a karate student was struggling for her life, you don't think it's possible those could have got pulled down in the course of this struggle, but somehow that fact alone makes this an attempted rape of a child when the expert says there was no sign of any trauma whatsoever. And that example of reaching, we have seen a number of times in this case, the stretches that they want you to go to. They talk about Mr. Coons' DNA. I want to get into the DNA now. I know we heard a lot about it, but this is important. Because that's the crux of their case, and as we know from the detective, that's when they made the decision to charge. They said, we're going to charge Mr. Coons because we got a partial DNA match from the YSTR testing. What does that mean? Half of his chromosomes, there was a partial match to one of those. Now, the experts couldn't give us a percentage on what that means, but it's, half of a half is maybe a quarter. And of those, it is more likely that that little piece of a strand that they saw belonged to an Asian, an Hispanic, an African American, or a Native American before it would be in a Caucasian. Now, when I asked the state's expert about that, she agreed with me. After a recess and consultation, she came back and tried to backpedal on that. But she had to stick with that story. She couldn't back out of that. So these two YSTR strands that we're talking about found on Miss Ortega's body was not a match to Roy Coons. It was a partial match to part of his DNA. Why is that important? Because Mr. Coons had been in that home, stretching the carpet in that very bedroom before she died. And so had his father, who has the same skin condition that he has. It causes excessive shedding. And if you'll recall back, and it's been a few days, the experts in this case said, I would be more expecting to see trace DNA if someone had such a condition. And they did. Both of them. Roy Coons Sr., who it's presumed would also match that strand, had been in that trailer scratching, and as he said, you saw his arms, he leaves white skin cells everywhere he goes. But the state wants you to believe that somehow, in the struggle, Miss Ortega had never touched the carpet. A karate student fighting for her life just laid there and let herself be killed? I don't think so. You know, and if the state wants to guess about what happened and play the guessing game, well, isn't it also just as plausible that in that struggle she was clawing at the carpet? She was drugged down the hallway. Maybe she ran to the other end trying to get out the back window. Maybe that's how that happened. But you don't convict people on maybes. You don't convict people on guesses. The other part that the state's not wanting to talk about is the fact that we have 3 other known hits in CODIS to people's DNA that were in that trailer. One of which was on the bare skin of Johanna Ortega. The left breast swab, it's in the evidence, you can look at it. They got a hit on someone named Jerry Claiborne. They also got a hit on 2 people, Billy Trapani, who's in prison, and another guy named Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, as far as the detective knew, was supposed to have been on probation somewhere. They couldn't locate him. Ms. Ortega's mother said there was no reason for any 3 of those people to have been there. But yet, we can have Jerry Claiborne's DNA on Ms. Ortega's bare skin with no explanation of how she got in that trailer or what she was doing there. But yet, the man who did work in that trailer for nearly 15 years, who had a microscopic amount of DNA partially matching him on her body, is supposed to be the killer in this case. But just ignore the fact that 3 other people's DNA is there, with no explanation. And let's just accuse the one man who had the only legal reason to have been in that location multiple times, leaving trace amounts of DNA. And the trace amount's important, because I asked all the experts, particularly one, would you expect that the size of the amount of DNA material you had to be indicative of the fact that it was older? And they said yes. It degrades over time. But you can't tell time with DNA. That's part of the problem. You just can't tell time. You don't know how long it had been there. There's so many conditions that affect the degradation, according to the experts, that we can't date it. The examples about how far back you can go is just to show that you can get DNA from thousands of years ago, someone who's deceased. So 2 years ago is not only in the realm of possibility, it's not surprising, like the state would have you believe. So we've got this DNA, partial match, and then we have the one profile that they say matches Roy Coons. Now, I asked about that bathroom window, and there's photographs of it in the record for you to view. The outside of that window is opaque, it is dark, it is light-blocking glass, so people can't see in. It's in the bathroom. Why is that important? Because it blocks direct sunlight from coming into that trailer. If you look at the position of the trailer, it's doubtful direct sunlight ever went in that window, and if it did, that opaque window would have blocked it out. And that amount of DNA that they found, microscopic. Here's the other problem. We don't know exactly where from that window frame it was found, because as they collected it, they swiped the entirety of the frame and submitted the swab. Here's the other problem with that DNA profile is cybergenetics is not a laboratory. They are a software company. Why does that matter? They don't do testing. They crunch numbers. They are not accredited like Tennessee Bureau of Investigation and the Metro Crime Lab and the private lab that Ms. Cross works for. Why does that matter? Because if they had reported results based on the minute amount of material that they had, they would have lost their accreditation. It didn't meet the standards that their accrediting body set for them. So a software company is using a match with an amount of DNA that an accredited lab says is not enough to even say it's a match. It's not enough. But again, Mr. Coons did work in that trailer for years. Now, the state in their opening said, well, they didn't find his DNA anywhere else, but they didn't check anywhere else. They checked on her, they checked the window, they might have checked the door frame. Did they touch the door? Did they check under the sinks where Mr. Coons had replaced the faucets that his father knew about? Did they check the other bathroom to see if it was there? No. They could probably go there, according to the expert, and maybe still find his DNA there and in the other trailers that he had worked at. So you only have information on things that you check on. And they didn't check. They were concerned with two areas. So, microscopic amount of DNA that accredited labs would have rejected, partial strands of DNA that were more likely to be in an Asian, African American, Hispanic, Native American than in a Caucasian. That could have been anywhere in his paternal line. It may not have been his at all. And then you got the DNA of these three other people who have no reason to have been there and who were not followed up on to exclude them as having been involved in this. Because they did get tunnel vision in this case. They told you that. Once they had that partial match, and again, I use the term match loosely, it's not a match, it's just they can't exclude him. They can't say it's him. They can't say it's not. They didn't do any other investigative work related to any other suspect. They stopped. Despite the fact you have a man who's on probation, whose DNA is in that location with no possible explanation for it. And finally, there's also this DNA on the window, this bathroom window that they're making a big deal about on the outside. It's an unknown man. Whose is that? Wouldn't you expect that someone is going up and climbing in that window that you would find it on the outside? And they did, but it didn't match Mr. Coons. That window is over 6 feet from the ground to the base of it. Someone was outside that window who was a man, and it wasn't Mr. Coons. You know, something else that's important about DNA is of all the places that you would expect to find Roy Coons' DNA if he committed this crime, it would be on the murder weapon. This belt was wrapped around her neck, and it wasn't there. They also found unknown male DNA in the bra, on the bed frame, the windowsill, and in the waistband. Foreign DNA. Now, they hadn't gone to the trouble of comparing those unknown strands, partial strands, but my expert did. And uncontroverted, she told you that those all matched. Sort of. Because again, you can't do an exact match unless you hold the whole strand, but they were all consistent with each other. So we have these 4 locations where a man's DNA should not be: bra, bed frame, windowsill, waistband. And that could have been another person. But why does that matter? Because again, the state wants you to think that Mr. Coons did this based on some partial YSTR matching and data that accredited labs rejected. And they tried to ask questions during this trial about, well, maybe the perpetrator wore gloves. Their experts or their witnesses said there was no scientific evidence, including Officer Charles Linville, that the perpetrator wore gloves. So So if it wasn't Mr. Coons, who was it? Well, that's not our responsibility. We don't have to prove that. But there's some things that weren't cleared up. Jerry Claiborne, Billy Trapani, Donald Williams have already talked about. We know their DNA was there with no explanation. There was no follow-up to see where they were, no phone records to see where they were. Mr. Drexel, no follow-up to see where he was. And there's just something you want to talk about strange that's going on. Well, the family had to move there in a hurry, according to the mother. We don't know why. Mr. Hinton says the dad lives there, Mr. Ortega. And the mother says he did not. And his DNA was found inside there. We know that he came to visit, typically only on Thursdays, the same day that she was killed. And like some of the other people, the detectives tried to eliminate him as having been there, and they couldn't do it. I'm not saying he did, but I'm saying we're talking about speculating. You could speculate on any number of people in this case. That's 5 different people we could speculate about. Again, strange that the man who runs the trailer park says he lives there and he says he doesn't. Do you have something else important about Mr. Hinton's testimony that's been glossed over? The state made a big deal, and I suspect they will, that Miss Ortega would not have opened the door for anyone. Well, that's not true. Or that the children would. Because Mr. Hinton said, I went there to look at a truck, knocked on the door, and one of the daughters opened the door, called Dad, and within 2 or 3 minutes he was down there. They're not following Mom's rules. So this whole thing about they wouldn't have opened the door and therefore he must have come through the window, we know from Mr. Hinton they opened the door to people. Even though Mom told them not to. Also, Dad's separate residence that he said he was maintaining, never searched. Never searched to see if Miss Ortega's DNA or any evidence of a crime was there. But they sure went out of the way to search everything belonging to Mr. Coons. They searched his car, they swabbed it, fingerprinted it, went through his belongings, and what did they find? Nothing. They didn't find any DNA that shouldn't have been there. They didn't find Miss Ortega's DNA in there. They introduced a lot of evidence in this case that had nothing to do with anything. It was just stuff they recovered. It was 2 T-shirts from a campsite. It was a polo shirt that had Mr. Coons' DNA on it, even though they found it in his car. But what about Mr. Coons' actions immediately after this happened? Again, the state wants you to believe that she was killed right at 4:19, even though their own expert says, I have no idea. It could have been much earlier, it could have been later, we don't know. But they want to lock you into that time like that's the gospel. And then they show you Mr. Coons' cell tower records that show he was mostly at home. And then when you look at the little graph, ask their expert, how far was it from this dot to this sector of the tower? And he couldn't tell you, maybe a mile. It could have been that he was out walking the dog and could have hit that side of the tower. We don't know. But again, that's asking you to speculate. But he did speak with Madge Green that afternoon, around 5:15. Stayed there quite a while, had a normal discussion. She noticed nothing unusual about Mr. Coons. Nothing. He wasn't acting strange. He didn't look strange. And I'm holding out my arms because he was wearing a cut-off T-shirt and shorts and no shoes. He always dressed that way. She didn't notice anything about him, and you think if she hadn't noticed scratches on him, she would have remembered that, especially in light of what happened right after that. And you know who else didn't see anything unusual about Mr. Coons that night and his appearance? The detectives. People trained in observation. There's a discussion on one of those early interviews where they're asking about his tattoos. Now, do you think they really cared about his tattoos? They're checking him out. They're looking at his arms. They want to see if he had any defensive wounds on him. Did we hear any proof that he did? No, because he didn't. And again, if a young girl who's 12 years old, roughly 130 pounds, and a student of karate is being attacked, do you think she didn't fight back? But there was nothing unusual about that. I even asked his father today, when you got home that night, did you see anything unusual about your son? No, he didn't. So, the tunnel vision. Despite 3 other DNA hits being in that location, never followed up, never looked for other suspects, and that continued through today. Despite the fact that the partial DNA strands are more likely to be in every other race except Caucasian, they didn't do anything else. They settled on them. They relied on a purchased result from a software company using materials that, again, accredited labs wouldn't even look at. And there's other partial male foreign DNA, and the word foreign just means we don't know whose it was. It wasn't Mr. Coons, but we got all this other male DNA all over the crime scene. Which shows you that transfer is real, despite what the state wants you to think. If it wasn't real, how would we explain some of this other DNA that's there? Or maybe those people were there and we just don't know who they are. So they're trying to pin it on Mr. Coons. Now, Mr. O'Koff and Miss Hemingway came in here and they told you different stories. Mr. O'Koff said that Mr. Coons was having this philosophical discussion about if someone who's killed someone, can they be forgiven 3 times a day, every day, for an extended period of time. Miss Hemingway remembered one discussion in the car, and it was just that. If. So their stories didn't match up. Then Mr. O'Koff tells you the story about where his non-existing hair stood up, and it was a colorful story and interesting. But he thinks that may have occurred in October. The last time he saw him, it didn't, because Mr. Coons was arrested in September. And it scared him so much that he went and told Miss Hemingway, stay away from Roy Coons. Well, did Miss Hemingway tell you that she was told to stay away from Roy Coons? No. She didn't tell you that. And Mr. O'Koff couldn't even get the month and the year straight about when certain things happened. And I had to ask him repeatedly. Now, you said this one time and you're saying this now. Yeah, well, must have got mistaken. But after I went back and listened to what I said the first time, then I remembered. Now I remember. Yeah, it was that way. But as I was saying, Mr. O'Koff tells this story and he's so concerned about it. What does he do with that information? Nothing. He sat on it. Police come looking around, ask some questions, and there's his opportunity, and he takes it, and he hasn't been homeless since. But despite what he said about Mr. Coons wanting to leave the state, it never happened. Never happened. Oh, we're going to go to California. Did it? Did they go to California? No. But I asked the detective, is that car roadworthy? I mean, it's an important thing to know. I mean, somebody can have a car that might not make it outside the Davidson County line, but he said that it was. So he had the opportunity. We have a father who's giving him money whenever he needs it. He could have left, but he didn't, because there was no plan to go to California. And when he was arrested, 6 weeks after, he was at home, not in a homeless camp, not on the run, not boarding a bus for Kansas. He was at his house, and that's where he was. Again, actions of an innocent man. His statement indicates he had nothing to hide. He didn't try to put it off on anybody else. Told him exactly where he was, what he knew. Another important part about his statement was when they asked, how are we going to solve this? He tells them technology. This is a man trying to help them solve a crime that he did not commit. And finally, we have the text messages. The text messages. I told you I would come back to those, and here's what I'm going to say about that. If Miss Ortega was here and could testify, what she would tell you was, I don't know who knocked at the door. But she said so in her text message. She said, I think, words are important, I think it was the man who cuts the grass. Which man? Mr. Drexel? Mr. Hinton? Mr. Coons? But he's gone now. So if we want to play the speculation game, like the state's doing here, maybe she did hear a knock at the door. Maybe she looked out and she saw Mr. Coons walking by, walking his dog, like he told the police he'd been doing all day. She didn't say it was him, and she wasn't sure who it was. Could have been Mr. Drexel at the door. Could have been somebody else at the door. Because she said, I think, not that it was or that it is. Which gets me to how sure you have to be here. Okay? She guessed that day of who might have been at the door, but you don't get to guess. You have to make a decision based only on the proof that's here, not speculation, not guessing. And the state has to convince you beyond all reasonable doubt that Mr. Coons committed this crime. Not that he could have, not that it was possible, not that he lived in the neighborhood and spent a lot of time in a shed behind his dad's house. But beyond a reasonable doubt is not could have. It is proof that is so convincing that your mind has to rest easily on that decision. So if you decide that Mr. Coons actually committed this crime, you have to leave here, go home, go back about your lives, and not have any lingering doubt. And your mind has to rest easily that they have proven this case beyond a reasonable doubt. Could you forget about this other DNA that's on the scene of 3 different people that are unaccounted for? Can you forget that there's not a single witness placing Mr. Coons inside of C2 or around C2 on the day that this happened? Can you forget that there's not a single fingerprint placing Mr. Coons there? Any other scientific evidence? Can you forget that there's no evidence of Miss Ortega's DNA in Mr. Coons' car on his belongings in his home? Can you forget that Mr. Coons didn't have a single injury to his person, not a scratch that was reported? And you know this karate student, you know Miss Ortega, she fought. Can you forget that there's between 2 and 5 unknown male DNA strands in C2 that aren't accounted for, including on the outside of this window that we've heard a lot about? And that only a partial amount of DNA matches Mr. Coons, though the strand that matches Miss Claiborne apparently was a full strand. And that's on her naked skin, with no explanation, except transference that they don't want to talk about. Can you forget that Mr. Coons cooperated? The night of, 8 days later, sure, come on down, I'll tell you. And in that statement, didn't make excuses, didn't try to say he wasn't around that day. He didn't say anything that was inconsistent, despite what the state wants you to believe, about where he went that day. He told them, I was in and out from the get-go. And he was. And the state wants you to believe that somehow that amount of time between one of his phone calls and the others meant that he was in a certain location. Well, the experts told you, you only get cell tower data if the phone is in use. He could have went to the market, 2 minutes later been back, an hour later went to the market, and if he got the 2 calls when he's in the market, well, does that mean he was at the market for an hour? Of course not. But he was even given the opportunity to put it on somebody else. Can you forget that? That he was given the opportunity to say, well, who was it? Who else was it? I looked up sex offenders, and I don't know. I can't tell you who it was. He didn't try to point the finger at anyone else. And he didn't try to distance himself from being where he lived and was there the day this happened. And again, a lot of this case was stuff that had nothing to do with it. I remember asking one witness, so you have nothing to add to this case? And he said no. But they called him anyway, because they're trying to, I guess, saturate you with information, hoping that you will think that because we did so much that it has to be Mr. Coons because we can't say it's anybody else. Well, an absence of something is not proof of anything. It's just an absence of proof. Just like the absence of proof against Mr. Coons. I only get one opportunity to talk to you. That's the way the rules are. It's just how it is. I don't want you to think because of that when the state gets up and says all they're about to say and I say nothing that you think it's because I wouldn't want to rebut that. I would. But the rules say this is my only chance to speak with you about this case. And I want you to remember that your decision here can't be based on sympathy. And we know that the state has tried to play on your sympathies. They played a 911 call for you here that caused some of you to cry because it was sad and it was an awful thing to have to listen to. But it added nothing to what we already knew about the case. I suspect that in their closing coming up, they may play some more of that, or they may show you some photographs that's intended to get that reaction from you. But the judge will instruct you, you can't base your decision on that sympathy. You have to base it only on the facts, not on that sympathy. So, don't forget, Mr. Coons sits here presumed innocent. Don't forget that proof beyond a reasonable doubt is not based on speculation. It's not based on guessing. Don't ignore their own scientific evidence that other people unaccounted for, one of whom was on probation, was in that trailer at some point, or his DNA sure was. And don't let them rest on, well, we did our best. We can't tell you who for sure. Let's point on Mr. Coons. He seemed a little strange. It's not a crime to be strange or to be different, or to live partially in a shed behind your parents' house. That's not illegal. It's not illegal to be homeless at some times in your life. Base it on the proof that was here. And I'm submitting to you that based on the proof you've heard, not only did the state not carry the burden, what they've proven to you is that Mr. Coons is innocent. He's an innocent man. And that can only be overcome by proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And ask yourselves, as you listen to what they have to say at the closing, is that enough that you can leave here and your mind rest easily on a verdict of guilt? And if it can't, the only verdict you can return is not guilty. It's been a long 6 days, and I thank you for your time and attention.